When I ask people who was the most evil man who ever lived, most people will automatically say Adolf Hitler. But there's been some other really bad, evil leaders in this world, including Mao Zedong of China, and in this case, we're going to be looking at the rise of Joseph Stalin. This is for my AP European history classes, and today we're going to be looking at the rise of a dictator who was responsible for the lives of millions of deaths of his own countrymen. So let's take a look at the rise of Joseph Stalin and who this guy is. Joseph Stalin was actually born Joseph Jugashvili. Stalin was not his real name. We'll talk about what that means in just a moment, but he was not even actually Russian. He was born in the province of Georgia, which today is an independent country, but at that time was under the power of the Russian Empire. He was born in 1879, and as a Georgian, he did speak with an accent. Compared to most of the Russian elites that he was hanging out with. So for a lot of people, he didn't fit in originally as a pure Russian. He was Georgian, and he always held that as a matter of pride. He was extremely poor. He grew up in an abusive situation. His father was an alcoholic who would beat him very cruelly. Despite being poor, his marks and grades in school were good enough that they attracted the attention of a local seminary, which is a training university for priests. So he went to this seminary, and while he was at the seminary studying to go into the priesthood for the Orthodox Church, he was exposed to socialist politics. There were a lot of socialists, a lot of Marxists, a lot of communists at all the higher places of higher education, and he became indoctrinated by socialism. In 1899, Stalin decided to drop out of school, and he joined a Marxist revolutionary movement. Russia was still under the power of the czars at that time. The czars treated their people cruelly, ignored the plight of the peasants. And so Marxism was a very popular alternative to people in this environment. Stalin quickly changed his name. He changed his name to Stalin, which means steel. Basically, he was saying his name was Joseph, Man of Steel. Stalin soon got the attention of the most important revolutionary leader in Russia, a guy that we've talked about named Vladimir Lenin. Stalin had a talent for getting things done. A lot of the Bolsheviks, who were the members of Lenin's Communist Party, were intellectuals. They'd go to coffee houses and they would debate and discuss the dialectics of communism and Marxism. Stalin saw this as all talk. He was someone who would actually, rob banks or beat up people, or when something had to be done, Stalin could be counted on. And this got the attention of Lenin. Lenin saw Stalin as one of the true targets of what Marxism was all about, going after the lower classes and people who were of the regular class of people in Russia. Because of his status as a Georgian, Joseph Stalin was given a position within the new Bolshevik party of Lenin called he was known as the Commissar of Nationalities. Now, at first, a lot of people would have thought this is not a very important position in government. This is a position that is really just, just kind of a political career killer. This is not really going to help him out. But what it did is it allowed him to be the liaison between all the different nationalities and ethnic groups within Russia to the Bolsheviks. And there's a lot of ethnicities, a lot of nationalities within Russia even today. And so he was able to build up a network of contacts and allies that he would use much, much later on. So being named the Commissar of Nationalities at first doesn't seem like a big deal. It doesn't seem like a very prestigious title, but it's going to really help his political career down the road. In 1922, he was eventually named the General Secretary of the Communist Party, which means that he's in charge of party business. The party was still ruled under Vladimir Lenin, but this gave Joseph Stalin increasingly more power in his rise. Lenin had begun to have doubts about Stalin's abilities to be the great leader of the Communist Party, and actually had written kind of a secret will of sorts, basically saying that I'm not really a big fan of Joseph Stalin being my successor. I liked what he could do for the party. He would be a man of action, but I'm actually a little nervous about, there's something about this man I do not trust. So he recommended that his chief lieutenants, Trotsky and Bukharin, to become his successors of the Bolshevik Party upon his death. However, Lenin, when he died, Stalin was able to use all those connections and all those political alliances that he had made as Commissar of Nationalities to oust Trotsky and Bukharin. Trotsky was eventually exiled to Mexico and then later killed by an ice pick by a KGB agent. Bukharin was eventually killed. Stalin began having these trials. They became known as show trials because they were just a mockery of justice. He would bring in old heroes of the revolution and have them put on trial. And people were shocked in Russia. These were guys who had been lifted up as heroes during the Russian Revolution. And now Stalin has them on trial as traitors to the revolution. He had signed confessions from these guys. Now, these confessions that said that they were betraying their country were signed under torture. And so they weren't really legit. Stalin quickly began creating this cult of personality around him, and originally around him and Lenin. He wanted people to know that the reason he's in power is because Vladimir Lenin, the hero of the revolution, wanted him in power, and that together they had led Russia to be able to destroy the reign of the czars. Another roadblock to Stalin's consolidation of power was the military. Joseph Stalin had never served in the military, and so he had a great distrust of the military. So for 10 years after he began to take power, he began to purge the military, killing thousands of competent military officials. They would be arrested or accused of ridiculous crimes. Sometimes they'd be sent to labor camps. Worse yet, they'd often be executed. So he begins to get rid of anybody he saw as a potential rival to his power. And during the 1920s and 1930s, millions of Russians were imprisoned or executed for posing a threat to the regime. They were put in these series of labor camps known as gulags. Some of these threats were real. There were people who were beginning to rebel against the idea of Joseph Stalin having power, but a lot of these were imagined threats. This guy became more and more paranoid that people were trying to take over. I don't know what Joseph Stalin is actually signing in this picture that you see here on the presentation, but it's quite possible he's signing death warrants. He was responsible for the deaths of hundreds of thousands of military officers. If you were in a cafe and you accidentally were like you were cutting out coupons in your newspaper and you cut off across a picture of Joseph Stalin accidentally, someone sitting at the cafe next to you could turn you in to the secret police and you could be arrested simply for desecrating the image of Joseph Stalin. Children were encouraged to rat out their teachers and their parents if they were criticizing Joseph Stalin in any way, in any form, in any way possible. So you began to see paintings of Joseph Stalin, or the great leader, scattered throughout Russia. Statues were being put up everywhere as people were beginning to see this guy as kind of a new god. I mean, Christianity was now officially illegal. The Orthodox religion was officially illegal under the communist regime. So Joseph Stalin began to kind of take on this godlike figure within the Soviet Union with these paintings and pictures and murals and portraits everywhere you went. You woke up in the morning seeing portraits of Joseph Stalin. Everybody's house had to have pictures of Joseph Stalin, and you went to bed at night seeing a portrait of Joseph Stalin. His image was everywhere. Joseph Stalin began to realize that the Marxist revolution that had been predicted by Karl Marx and hoped for by Vladimir Lenin, they had this idea that all of Western Europe was going to rebel against their leaders and have this worldwide communist revolution. When that began to fail to take hold, Stalin began to focus on socialism in one country. That was his big motto, was socialism in one country, where the idea was that we need to create a country that is a fortress of socialism, and then maybe eventually down the road we can expand communism to other places around the world. He kind of rejected the idea of communist expansionism, unless it was natural and easy, and he would conquer anybody that he'd like if it was something that didn't seem to be too much of a struggle. Stalin believed that for socialism to survive in the Soviet Union, the Soviets had to catch up to Western Europe and the United States in their industrial capacity. They were far behind the United States and Western Europe in factories. And so they began this system, this whole emphasis on building factories and becoming a modern industrialized country, because during the Communist Revolution, the Soviet Union was still a fairly, was pretty much almost all agrarian. So Stalin instituted a series of 5-year plans. Actually would have 3 5-year plans, and he would initiate quotas and guidelines about how many factories have to be built and how many products need to be produced. He also began to forcibly collectivize these farms of this noble class of Russians known as the kulaks. Began to take these farms, these small family farms, or sometimes pretty big estates, and collectivize them into these government farms, where he was getting rid of the family farms or the estates that were run by nobles during the Russian Empire, and make them state farms, government farms. Industrial quotas were being rigidly enforced. If you did not build your factory in time, you as the foreman could be executed or sent to a work camp. If you did not produce the amount of modern materials that you were supposed to, you could be killed. So as a result, I mean, many of these quotas were ridiculous and were never going to be, possible. Many of these factory owners began to forge their quotas. There was all kinds of lying and cooking the books and all sorts of things during this time, because people didn't want to die for Joseph Stalin's ridiculous quotas. During the 1920s and 30s, 5 million Russians would die from either punishment for not working effectively in these factories or on the state government farms, or they died as a result of this amazing famine, this amazingly terrible famine that happened as a result of these farms no longer producing, because they were government farms now, and people didn't have the incentive to work hard, and so they just stopped working. And so this famine killed millions, and you could be arrested for even mentioning that there was a famine. You weren't even supposed to acknowledge that there was a famine. That was a state crime under Joseph Stalin. Okay? So you can see this guy was a pretty bad guy, and I hope you guys can read some more in your textbook. But basically, Joseph Stalin, one of the worst, most cruel dictators ever. This kind of went over his rise, and we'll talk to you later. Peace.